Hello, friends, and welcome to the Philosophy of Health. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Philosophy of Health. This week we will be discussing Immanuel Kant, who is a pretty complex character who did philosophy during the Enlightenment, and he's a very powerful figure. He's a very influential figure during a time when the world was undergoing an epochal shift. It was, in effect, ushering in a new age. And during this age, history was rewritten. And in the following interview, we talk about the conditions that was done in, that answer the question as to why it was rewritten. And it's the history that we all know today. And so with this interview, you are invited to question the history of Western civilization in its entirety. History is important because the current narrative that reigns is that basically only white people have contributed to history, or at least Western civilizations. And if we believe that narrative, then by logical extension, white supremacists have a point. If we believe, as Hobbes argued, that life before civilization was short, nasty, and brutish, then we believe that today, this era, is the best, most peaceful, and most advanced period our species has ever known. If, however, we are able to examine evidence and show that before the rise of Caucasian dominance in the Western world was preceded and stands on the shoulders of past cultures that have previously been deemed primitive or barbarian, and we see that they are not, then it changes the way we see and value indigenous people and ancient texts and ancient ways of life that precede the birth of ancient Greece. So whoever controls history is very, very important. And the book that we're discussing today, called Africa, Asian, and the History of Philosophy, Racism in the Formation of the Philosophical Canon by Peter Park, we see scholarly evidence for questioning the narrative that philosophy students are taught, and by extension, the history that all of us are taught. I think we're living in an age where we're realizing that Christopher Columbus wasn't a great guy. We're keeping in mind that the founding fathers, who wanted to be free, owned slaves. And in philosophy departments, I think that there's a slow awakening of questioning the lineage of philosophers, analyzing their biographies to see their prejudices in a discipline that would like to see itself as objective. So I really think this book is very, very important. I think it'll be very influential, but it exists in a space that I think is difficult because it's a short book. It's just a little over 200 pages, but it is dense, and it is written in very technical philosophical language. So I had to read it 3 times and take notes, copious notes, to really get to the point where I felt like I really understood what the argument was, because I was trained in very conservative philosophy departments. And I was taught a version of history that turns out to be very, very wrong, and led me to conclusions that were oppressive and harmful. And so this book has a lot of relevance, actually. It's kind of exciting that that it's so obvious that philosophy is irrelevant. because in our current culture, racism is surely very much on people's minds. But the book is written in a very technical language, and philosophers and philosophy scholars have a vested interest in ignoring this argument because their careers are based on it and are based on the status quo, on the mainstream history taught in philosophy departments. So if we find out that much of ancient Greek philosophy is second-rate Indian philosophy, well, you got some people who are out of jobs. But I think that a lot of intelligent people, very thoughtful people who haven't studied philosophy and don't have access to the technical language that this book uses would very much benefit from its teachings. And so I've invited Peter Park on the program to talk about his book and for us to try as best as we can to lay out what really happened in this time period when history was rewritten to tell a specific narrative of white Caucasian people and cut out people from Africa and Asia, namely Egyptians and Indians, that is, people from India. And so this will actually be a series of what I foresee as being 3 parts. It initially was going to be 2 parts, but we apparently needed 1 episode just to shit all over Immanuel Kant. So that's what we do in this episode, but we also talk about his undeniable influence. And even though it may not seem this way in the interview, I actually do like Immanuel Kant. You know, everything is yin and yang. He certainly did some really bad things that philosophy scholars don't want to look at, but he also did contribute, and that's part of the reason why he is considered to be such a kingmaker. Now, the second interview will be about the competing versions of history that were going on, because it's always interesting to explore history by historians in different eras because they're closer to that history. I mean, it's interesting to read Herodotus, for example, because he got to actually visit ancient Egypt. And sure, he was kind of a racist prick, but he still does have descriptions of these people in the same way that early settlers describe, savage Native Americans. You can read the racism, you can see it, but also there are facts there. Even if they are couched in judgments, you're still able to extract it, right? It's like a drunk guy at a bar telling you how crazy everybody else is. You still get a sense of what the scene was. You just kind of feel bad for everyone else. So before we get into it, and before we get into who Kant is and the Enlightenment and why this period of history is so important, I wanted to read you a quote by a very famous German poet, Heinrich Heine. And perhaps it's rhetorical overkill, but in a way I think that it is also very, very true. It is said that the spirits of the night are alarmed when they catch sight of the executioner's sword. How then must they be alarmed when they are confronted by Kant's critique of pure reason? This book is the sword with which deism was put to death in Germany. Frankly, in comparison with us Germans, you French are tame and moderate. You have at most been able to kill a king. Immanuel Kant has stormed heaven. He has put the whole crew to the sword. The supreme lord of the world swims unproven in his own blood. It's hard to see in retrospect that what Kant was doing was really revolutionary. He published the critique. The Critique of Pure Reason had more than one version, and he wrote separate prefaces for both. What he was doing was he was trying to base reality in science as opposed to religion, namely Christianity. So what he was doing was he was saying we can know things without knowing God. And also that you cannot prove nor disprove the existence of God. Reason can't touch those things, and he wanted to base everything in reason. And saying this at the time was extremely risky. So his first preface to the Critique of Pure Reason was very short. The second preface is very long. And it's basically a love letter to the Queen of Prussia, because Germany didn't exist until 1871. And so the second prologue is basically 10 pages of him saying, please don't kill me for heresy. So he was a rebel in a certain respect. He did give a foundation to science. He did sort of give philosophy a bailout because it was quickly becoming irrelevant with the advent of modern science. But what most people don't know about him was that he was incredibly racist, and while everyone for the most part in that period was probably racist, he was especially racist and developed our first theory of race, our first philosophical theory of race that we still use today. Professor Park and I will be talking in the third episode about what the discoveries in this book mean, what its consequences are, because they are quite great. It is a large thing to say that the foundation that you're standing on is false. Basically, the equivalent of what his book is your parents telling you that you're adopted. He's telling us that ancient Greece is not our father. So, without further ado, I give you Peter Park. Thanks. Hello, Peter. How are you?
I'm good. Hi.
Hi.
See you.
So, welcome to the podcast. Peter Kwon-Jun Park. Did I pronounce that properly?
Yes.
Great. You've written a very interesting book that caught my eye, published by State University of New York, by SUNY. And your book is, the subtitle is Racism in the Formation of the Philosophical Canon. And so to start, I think we need to give a bit of a general introduction for people who didn't study philosophy. So I wanted to kind of get to basics of why philosophy is important and what it is and why we should care what people were talking about 200 years ago. Some of my thoughts were that philosophy was basically the humanities for most of human history. There was art, there was history, there was poetry, but there were no literature departments. We didn't have psychology or sociology, anthropology, gender studies, or racial theory, which is why philosophy is important and why history is important, because philosophy is basically the backbone of Western civilization. Now, your book argues that history was written during the Enlightenment, or rewritten during that Enlightenment, which seriously disrupts the traditional view of philosophy that every Philosophy 101 student is taught in college, but which many of our listeners may not know. So I was hoping you could tell us that story of what most of us are taught.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak to you about my book. It's a huge honor, and I'm always happy to gather more readers and thinkers of my book and to hear their views. The Enlightenment period is roughly the period beginning in the late 17th century and running its course throughout the 18th century and crossing into the early part of the 19th century. So that is the Enlightenment period. This is a period in which thinkers and other intellectuals, writers, philosophical writers, but also literary writers have given us theories of natural rights. This is the period in which slavery as a trade and also as a economic institution began to be questioned, and in parts of the world and in parts of the American colonies met its end. This is a period in which educated persons from middle classes as well as noble classes questioned traditional religion and religious authorities. There was also questioning of political authorities, mainly monarchical authority.
So this is the time of the Reformation. There's a religious revolution going on. There are political revolutions going on. It's a revolutionary time globally.
Yes, Yes, and that should critically be mentioned and included in getting a full picture of this period. There is a constitutional or a political revolution in England by 1689, in North America, in the British part of North America in 1776 to 1783, in France starting in 1789, so it's a revolutionary time, questioning of absolutist monarchical forms of government with the aid of new theories of natural rights, which become human rights in the 20th century after World War II. So in this period, there is also an activity, an intellectual project, or a project on the part of historians to rewrite human history and to rework concepts of history and approaches to history. And this is a period in which biblically based and biblically framed history writing is changed to more secular, more science-adherent views of the human past. So the vision of the human past becomes longer, breaking out of the 4,000 years or so frame of biblical history, breaking out of also Near Eastern and Jewish point of origin or focus, to arranging the view of the origins and the progress and future of human history. Human history, by the way, is understood as the unfolding of civilization, and the breaking out and the rewriting of this history. The result of it is that we have the rise of a new story of human progress, and it's given a Greek and Roman origin. The Jewish heritage or contribution to human history can't completely be ignored or shut out, but it is reduced. Egypt is reduced in its contribution.
Well, before we get into that, I wanted to kind of get a survey into when a student takes a Philosophy 101 class and they're taught the history of philosophy, what is that narrative?
That narrative is that philosophy was invented by the Greeks, that philosophy is the occurrence of scientific, mathematical, and legitimate, as in recognizably scientific and distinctively disciplinary, in the sense that philosophers today would recognize what the Greeks did and what they invented to be philosophy. So there's a retrospective recognition of this Greek intellectual product, that this Greek conception of philosophy was carried forward by medieval Europeans in the main.
Via the Roman Empire.
Via the Roman Empire, yes, right. Because the Romans were, in history, historians teach that the Romans inherited Greek sciences and therefore Greek philosophy.
And their gods.
And their gods, yes. So the whole Greek complex of civilization. And that this Greek-Roman civilization was preserved and carried forward for future generations by medieval Christian Europeans. There is a kind of acknowledgement of the part played, and in fact, it is the decisive part played by Arab and other Middle Eastern scholars and traditions of scholarship that preserved this Greek civilization in the form of copying Greek texts, translating them into Arabic and Syriac, Hebrew, and eventually into Latin. And Arabs and Jewish thinkers or scholars were involved in this, as well as European scholars. So there is an unavoidable acknowledgement of Middle Eastern societies' contribution to preserving this ancient Greek-Roman scientific and all other kinds of knowledge. But mainly the account or the narrative, this ancient knowledge was preserved and passed down by the medieval Europeans to the modern Europeans, right? So the Europeans from Greeks onward are attributed with being the agents, with being the ones responsible for maintaining and adding to and developing science and all other knowledge, including knowledge of the fine arts, knowledge of architecture, and that is what modern philosophy is. Modern philosophy's origin or basis, the concepts, the definitions, and the earliest examples of philosophers and the work of philosophy come from the Greeks, according to this narrative.
But it's not just philosophy, it's also Western civilization in its entirety, that it was born with this anomaly of a genius civilization that sort of spontaneously erupted in ancient Greece, and the lineage is noticeably white, with some acknowledgement that the Arab world helped to preserve it, which they may actually regret now. And so your book is really, it's a critique of that story. And so I'm interested in stepping back for a moment just to talk a little bit about how you came to write this book. I'm assuming that you didn't say, hey, I'm going to take Immanuel Kant, the greatest philosopher in modern history, and portray him as a proto-Nazi and turn him into philosophy's version of Bill Cosby. So can you tell us, what did this book start as and how did it turn into what it turned into?
Well, to answer that question, I would have to go into, my personal story and get a little biographical in my discussion. When I was a college student, a first-year college student, I took my first course in philosophy, and it happened to be a course that was, I would say, a course of or in comparative philosophy, and there were so-called Western philosophical texts as part of the syllabus, and then there was also this Buddhist philosopher, Nagarjuna, also a required part of the course syllabus. And so my first exposure to philosophy was wider and more open than actually the majority of philosophy students and teachers would have it. So this was a very fortunate way of exposing me to philosophy. But after the course, I soon discovered that actually that is not the usual understanding of what philosophy is and what belongs in a philosophy course.
Yes, that's very rare.
Yeah, so I have my professor, Jay Garfield, to thank for that fruitful first exposure. So the question of why philosophy was so narrowly conceived as Greek in origin and Greek in definition became a kind of like enduring concern or intellectual question for me, and a good part of the rest of my undergraduate years and into my graduate years became an occupation with this question. So that isn't in my book, so no one knows it except you and anyone else listening, that actually I've been, as a young inquiring mind, occupied with this question of why the academy was so exclusionary to so-called non-Western philosophies when at the beginning of my college education, I was shown perfectly good examples of philosophy from India and from Asia. And so Immanuel Kant is possibly the most important modern Western philosopher. More web pages are dedicated to him than any other philosopher.
Well, let's give a little bit of a background before we get into him. So we know that in the German Enlightenment, you write that there was an intentional refashioning. It was a coordinated effort of the intelligentsia of the German Enlightenment around the 1780s, when for the first time philosophy started trying to address race. And followers of Immanuel Kant began separating non-white people out of the canon, making Greece the foundation of Western civilization. And I think that for most people who study philosophy, I mean, it's never asked. That Western civilization, that philosophy began in ancient Greece is never questioned in traditional philosophy departments. It's just the narrative. So I think that most people who study philosophy would be very surprised to hear, as I did, that virtually no one thought that in the 18th century, except for, as you know, 3 published philosophers. And so now at this time, I'd like to go into more about what was going on in this period. You talked about slavery and the political revolutions that are going on. Historically, we have colonialism, which gave birth to the slavery that you referred to. It was sort of somewhere in the cycle of the first wave of globalization, which is really just globalized colonialism.
Yes.
But intellectually, in the academies, there was what is referred to as the Oriental Renaissance. Can you talk a little bit about what that was and what it looked like? What was happening that hadn't happened before?
Sure. By virtue of Europeans conquering and colonizing the non-European parts of the globe, including Asia, those Europeans came in contact with indigenous traditions of knowledge in the indigenous languages, including Sanskrit and more Persian and Chinese. And it made possible European understanding or learning of Asian traditions of knowledge. And the Oriental Renaissance is the name that historians and scholars who study this period or this episode in colonial and modern history, Oriental Renaissance is how it is referred to. So it refers to Europeans such as the British Chief Justice or magistrate at Bengal, William Jones, and his acquiring knowledge of Sanskrit and his study of Indian traditions through the study of Sanskrit texts and his interest in not only the laws of the Hindus, but also the philosophy and also the mythology and literary tradition of the Hindus. So there's William Jones, there is Friedrich Schlegel, the German, who also learned Sanskrit and Persian. There's
also Max Muller, who began the first translations of Eastern texts.
Yes, that's right.
Although he wasn't a philosopher, he was a religion guy. I always love, I think, the opening quote of the book, which is, he said, "To know one is to know none."
Yes, of his book, yes.
Yeah, and what's interesting actually about that group is they chose 50 sacred texts, including books like the Bhagavad Gita and other books that people might be familiar with. But he wanted to include the Old Testament, but they wouldn't let him because they didn't want people to think of it as an Eastern text, even though by all means it is.
It is.
But he wasn't allowed to include it in this 50-volume Eastern sacred text collection. So we have translations of Sanskrit and Persian, and to give people a little bit of a historical context, the Rosetta Stone also was found in 1799, and it was deciphered in 1822. So this period of the Enlightenment is also when we finally have access to hieroglyphics, and they're no longer this mysterious script. We actually can read the stories.
Yes.
The prefix Indo comes into birth because people are recognizing that Sanskrit is actually related to European languages.
Uh-huh.
And also, as you know, Aryan becomes a word.
Yes, Aryan, Indo-European, yeah. So, as you allude to, it's a period in which the European understanding of European roots is being challenged, or it is being remade and given a wider scope, a kind of Indo-European or the word that was used not in the 18th century, but used in the 19th century, the word Aryan. So this Aryan heritage, already it began to look much older, more ancient than even the previously dominant conception or frame of European roots, the Bible, right? So the biblical account of European roots. The Aryan one looked older and longer, and in fact, it looked more Asian, right? And so because of Indo-Aryan or Indo-European languages being spread as far east as India and Central Asia. So yes, so this is happening as well.
And the good thing to come out of this is that philosophers really return to basics. They start asking very basic philosophical questions. Again, they're asking about the history of philosophy. Therefore, they're asking, what is philosophy? They're really returning to those basic Socratic questions.
Yes.
And you write that the history of philosophy and philosophy itself are indistinguishable. I wanted to see if you could flesh that out a bit for us. Why is it that we can't have one without the other? We can separate out, for example, the history of science from science, or the history of mathematics from mathematics. What makes philosophy special?
Well, that is a argument made by Friedrich Schlegel that philosophy and the history of philosophy are indistinguishable. He intended that as a kind of reply or as an attack on, at the time, the mainstream or the established academic philosophers. So he intended that as his reply to them, because they were trying to create a philosophy which they detached from history, a view of philosophy that is detached from understanding it or seeing it as a historical development. So Schlegel meant his aphoristic statement that philosophy and the history of philosophy are one and the same. He meant that to strongly suggest that philosophers and new people coming to the study of philosophy should understand philosophy completely in terms of what it is by means of studying what it has been. And so he's one of these proponents of the Oriental Renaissance, and he was, for a part of his adult life, very open to Indian and Chinese philosophy. And so having a authentically or an honestly historical approach to philosophy, seeing philosophy as having this history, was for him to keep the idea of philosophy very open and inclusive. So he was doing that. He was also attacking the idea that philosophy is a bunch of abstractions, just conceptual work that was adjudged to be good or bad or successful or not based on how well a bunch of abstractions cohered with themselves, right? So this was a very impoverished and also an impotent view of what philosophy is, instead of addressing those fundamental life-oriented questions that philosophy has addressed over its long history and all over the world in all the different world traditions. This is something you were already alluding to, right? The perennial or the real, at least real for human existence and how to understand human life. That philosophy had this other purpose, this wider, more humane and practical purpose, but it had become such an abstraction and thing of the academy that Schlegel, and he's writing this around 1800, said that as a way to break out from and break up a very academic, in many ways sterile, conception of philosophy.
So at this point of the interview, I'm sure that there are people out there saying, this sounds a lot like the book Black Athena, which explored many of these themes. They explored,
Yes.
I've never read it, but I'm aware that it explored Egypt as maybe the cradle of civilization and seeing it as a beginning point of philosophy and the arts and so forth. I've read some different reviews of your book, and the people who have taken the time to read this book, who have a philosophy background, no one seems to dispute it, whereas Black Athena was very controversial. Its biggest critique was its lack of rigor, which every review that I read of your book comments that your book is very rigorous. It's very scholarly rigorous. So I think what your book has in common with Black Athena is that it is so far out of the mainstream.
Yes.
That a lot of people's initial reaction is to dismiss it because it contradicts everything they've been taught about the history of philosophy. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on Black Athena and how it differs or how it relates to your book.
Martin Bernal did do a service to scholarship and to education by writing his 3-volume work called Black Athena, to the extent that he raised questions that weren't going away. And that is the question why the non-Greek world was shut out of European and Western understanding of its intellectual roots, and the effect of racism, anti-Semitism, and degradation of non-European traditions of philosophy, and also the underappreciation of African civilizations. So he was after these humane and international political concerns, which he brought out through his book. So there were many challenging suggestions that he made in the book. It had a very ambitious aim and also scope, since he extended his research into not only Greek and Roman literature, but also Egyptian literature or knowledge, bringing in also West Asian or Near Eastern civilization. And he had to do a lot of this inquiry based on secondary literature, meaning other scholars' work. Now, that's only natural that a scholar does not have a deep training in all these, what are separate fields of knowledge, which a scholar could spend all her career studying in one of these fields. So Bernal was wanting to argue a huge thesis, and a thesis in several parts, that Greek civilization actually has African origins via Egypt. So that included the thesis that Egyptian civilization was actually Afro-Asiatic and not so much assimilatable to Greek or Mediterranean civilization. It also included the thesis that why modern people don't understand the Greeks to have African roots, cultural or civilizational roots. It involved the thesis that this had to be covered up starting in the 18th century. So he was arguing a huge multi-part thesis. It was ambitious, and it lacked rigor. It lacked scholarly rigor, and because there was so much prejudice today, my colleague at Montana State, Dan Flory, would say implicit bias against such views. When he came out with his book, it was treated to severe critique, like severe by many, and it was very heated. It was a debate that even made it into the general news in the mid-'80s. And so scholars could undermine his arguments by arguing that his work was simply not a good piece of scholarship. So again, his thesis was prescient because, like yourself, other readers are finding echoes of what Martin Bernal was arguing in his book from the 1980s. So his work is important to me, but it sustained all this critical attack that its status was reduced, and not only scholars but students stopped to pay attention to his work. And for all these years, it has been read in small circles of intellectuals and delegitimized. So that proved to be a lesson to me, and I was not going to repeat those flaws in my work so as to avoid that criticism, right? And then having my work undermined by the charge of shoddy scholarship and have it be ignored. So that was a huge lesson to me, and I have him as a kind of predecessor, right, and also as an example of the challenges.
Well, and just for listeners to know the kind of rigor that exists in your book, obviously you're drawing on secondary scholarship as well. You've read Bernasconi, who's actually at the head of the philosophy and history series that you're published under. He did a lot of the work, but also you go to primary sources. And what I thought was so interesting was that you're looking at primary sources that people who study Kant and study Hegel wouldn't know about. Their lecture notes, their scholarly side pieces, they're not part of published essays, you really get into the depths of their intellectual thought that didn't necessarily go on the record per se. And you also read essays that are more obscure, that I had never heard of, and that I think actually a lot of Kant scholars probably had never heard of, or if they had, they just never bothered to really pay attention to it because in the scope of philosophy, it didn't seem terribly relevant to them. So with the book, you're talking about where people thought Western civilization began before this rewriting of history during the period of the Enlightenment with Kant. And you mentioned the Bible. Probably most people thought Western civilization started with Adam or Noah or Moses. There's also the Egyptians, there was Zoroaster, there was the Chaldeans in the Middle East, and there were also the ancient Orientals, which for the most part usually means India. And then a guy named Meiners comes along, and he and Immanuel Kant pass a super racist baton back and forth. Like, I imagine them with Twitter accounts just making each other more racist. And so first of all, most people have never heard of Meiners, and people who have probably aren't familiar with his racial views. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about him and what he is known for by the people who actually know who he is.
Yes. Christoph Meiners is still a relatively obscure philosopher and writer from the 18th century. He died in 1810. And when I began to investigate him, and that was starting at around after 2000, I could hardly find any scholarly publications discussing him. Luckily, he wrote a lot. He wrote 40 books.
Holy shit.
Yes, he wrote 40 books. He wrote almost 200 journal articles, and he wrote in all genres, and his works can be found in any library that has an old collection, like an old European library. All of them would have his works.
Wow.
Yes. So it's not like people don't know his work from not being able to read his writings. They are in German. They are not in modern editions. For example, you can't order his books on Amazon. These days, I think you might be able to order a couple of writings by him on Amazon. So there's a way to find out about him, and I did so. I had to read his writings as if I were one of the few ones who bothered to do so, besides a couple of older German scholars. And what he is he is a philosopher, but also he's a historian. And in the Enlightenment, many philosophers also were historians. So they wrote histories as well as works of philosophy.
It sounded, too, like if he were alive today, that he might even be an anthropologist.
Yes. Yes. So the distinction between anthropology and history didn't quite exist back then either. And the distinction between the study of, let's say, natural history and anthropology. And so what I mean is natural classification, right? So Linnaeus naming all the species, giving them genus name and a species name. This activity of classifying life forms actually was closely related to doing the same for peoples, so human groups. So Meiners was involved in that. But immediately, as a student of history, that reminds you of the activity of European colonists and what they do when they come upon African, Asian, American part of the world. And besides conquest, settlement, enslavement, and new forms of political and economic domination, along with that is this activity of anthropologically studying and classifying non-European peoples and also their culture. So Meiners was involved in that. And that is like an instantly recognizable colonialist intellectual activity or work. So he was that. But he also wrote in other genres closer to the European center of the world, right? So European histories, he wrote histories of religion, histories of science that encompassed not only Europe, the European part of that history, but also the non-European one. And so he is the one who is very open to the information coming in from the non-European world. So these are colonial reports and some medical reports, travel accounts, and all of this comes as information to him in the work he's doing in the area of historical studies, in the area of historiography, in other words. And he is the one, as I argue in my book, who is doing almost by himself, almost single-handedly, doing a lot of this rewriting of the history of civilization, history of philosophy, history of science. He is the one who almost single-handedly is rewriting civilizational history so that the Greeks are portrayed as the origin of modern civilization, modern or European civilization. And he is the one who is excluding non-Western or non-European, in other words, American civilization, definitely. That's easier for him to do because the pre-Columbian Americans are not geographically contiguous with the Old World. So he can just exclude them. But he also excluded Asian and African traditions from the story of the rise of modern civilization and modern science, and also from the story of the development of philosophy. So this is happening while he is writing very racist works of natural classification or anthropology about all peoples in the world. And there are works by him where the whole point of the book, one of his books, is to organize all the peoples of the world into a hierarchy of being. And you can already guess who is at the top of this hierarchy of humankind. The Northern Europeans are at the summit, and black human beings are at the nadir.
It's a bit like the Mormon Church.
Okay, yes. So hierarchical thinking, you can find it elsewhere. But this, too, is a part of the Enlightenment. So miners did not come up with this from nowhere, but there is a kind of activity of ordering all of nature and all living forms into a hierarchy of God's creation. So this is older, and Miners is just contributing to this, and he does it in the form of natural historical descriptions. So he thinks that he's contributing to natural science by describing the peoples of the world, classing them or grouping them along so-called racial attributes, and also arranging them into the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is also a civilizational hierarchy, with European civilization being the highest form and also the standard by which all the other civilizations can be measured. So he's doing all of this, all just like from his own mind and pen. And this person in Miners in his own period had to have had a wide readership that has become obscured now. He wrote so much, and what he wrote was, I think, so either urgent or so interesting to European readers that even though Kant does not cite Miners, as in like you will not find a single citation to Miners in Kant's writings, it is clear on evidence that Kant knew his writings and in fact adopted some of his views, used some of his data in his own lectures, and in Kant's more formal writings. Whether there is an influence from Miners is more obscure, but there is a live possibility that Miners, he is having an intellectual exchange with Miners, and that he had to have a considered view on many of Miners' theses or claims about human nature and human difference, racial difference. And some of this I do by doing a very basic textual comparison of passages in Miners with passages in Kant. And I believe that some of these similarities on the level of the text have to be explained as simple two-way adoption between minors and Kant. So Kant borrowing from minors, as well as minors also borrowing and using Kant's own ideas through his writings, through his publications. So this is what I show in my book. And apart from that, Kant also wrote on race. He wrote 3 essays on race. And he also lectured in the lecture hall, in other words, to a student.